Hello and welcome to Bookspot. I'm Earl Wajenberg. This time we're going to continue our reading of The Golden Key by George MacDonald. So far we've met a boy named Mossy who found the key that lies at the rainbow's foot, and now we are just beginning to meet a little girl who lives in a house at the edge of the woods of Faerie. But this house was quite a shame, and the fairies in the forest could not endure it. They tried everything on the maids without effect, and at last resolved upon making a clean riddance, beginning with the child. They ought to have known that it was not her fault, but they have little principle and much mischief in them, and they thought that if they got rid of her of the maids would be sure to be turned away. So one evening, the poor little girl having been put to bed early, before the sun was down, the servants went off to the village, locking the door behind them. The child did not know she was alone, and lay contentedly looking out of her window toward the forest, of which, however, she could not see much, because of the ivy and other creeping plants which had straggled across her window. All at once she saw an ape making faces at her out of the mirror, and the heads carved upon the great old wardrobe grinning fearfully. Then two old spider-legged chairs came forward into the middle of the room and began to dance a queer old-fashioned dance. This set her to laughing, and she forgot the ape and the grinning heads. So the fairies saw they had made a mistake, and sent the chairs back to their places. But they knew that she had been reading the story of Silverhair all day, so the next moment she heard the voices of the three bears upon the stair, Big Voice, Middle Voice, and Little Voice, and she heard their soft heavy tread, as if they had stockings over their boots, coming nearer and nearer to the door of her room, till she could bear it no longer. She did just as Silverhair did, and as the fairies wanted her to do. She darted to the window, pulled it open, got upon the ivy, and so scrambled to the ground. She then fled to the forest as fast as she could run. Now, although she did not know it, this was the very best way she could have gone, for nothing is ever so mischievous in its own place as it is out of it, and besides, these mischievous creatures were only the children of fairyland, as it were, and there are many other beings there as well. And if a wanderer gets in among them, the good ones will always be able to help him more than the evil ones will be able to hurt him. The sun was now set and the darkness coming on, but the child thought of no danger but the bears behind her. If she had looked round, however, she would have seen that she was followed by a very different creature from a bear. It was a curious creature, made like a fish, but covered, instead of scales, with feathers of all colors, sparkling like those of a hummingbird. It had fins, not wings, and swam through the air as a fish does through the water. Its head was like the head of a small owl. After running a long way, and as the last of the light was disappearing, she passed under a tree with drooping branches. It dropped its branches to the ground all about her, and caught her as in a trap. She struggled to get out, but the branches pressed her closer and closer to the trunk. She was in great terror and distress when the airfish, swimming into the thicket of branches, began tearing them with its beak. They loosened their hold at once, and the creature went on attacking them till at length they let the child go. Then the airfish came from behind her and swam on in front, glittering and sparkling all lovely colors, and she followed. It led her gently along till all at once it swam in at a cottage door. The child followed still. There was a bright fire in the middle of the floor, upon which stood a pot without a lid, full of water that boiled and bubbled furiously. The airfish swam straight to the pot and into the boiling water, where it lay quiet. A beautiful woman rose from the opposite side of the fire and came to meet the girl. She took her up in her arms and said, "Ah, you are come at last. I've been looking for you a long time." She sat with her on her lap, and there the girl sat staring at her. She had never seen anything so beautiful. She was tall and strong, with white arms and neck, and a delicate flush on her face. The child could not tell what was the color of her hair, but could not help thinking it had a tinge of dark green. She had not one ornament upon her, but she looked as if she had just put off quantities of diamonds and emeralds. Yet here she was in the simplest, poorest little cottage, where she was evidently at home. She was dressed in shining green. The girl looked at the lady, and the lady looked at the girl. "What is your name?" asked the lady. "The servants always called me Tangle." "Ah, that was because your hair was so untidy, but that was their fault, the naughty women. Still, it is a pretty name, and I will call you Tangle too. You must not mind my asking you questions, for you may ask me the same questions, every one of them, and any others that you like. How old are you?" "10," answered Tangle. "You don't look like it," said the lady. "How old are you, please?" returned Tangle. "Thousands of years old," answered the lady. "You don't look like it," said Tangle. "Don't I? I think I do. Don't you see how beautiful I am?" And her great blue eyes looked down on the little Tangle as if all the stars in the sky were melted in them to make their brightness. "Ah, but," said Tangle, "when people live long they grow old. At least I always thought so." "I have not time to grow old," said the lady. "I am too busy for that. It is very idle to grow old. But I cannot have my little girl so untidy. Do you know I can't find a clean spot on your face to kiss?" "Perhaps," suggested Tangle, feeling ashamed, but not too much to say a word for herself, "perhaps that is because the tree made me cry so." "My poor darling," said the lady, now looking as if the moon melted in her eyes, and kissing her little face, dirty as it was. "The tree must suffer for making a girl cry." "And what is your name, please?" asked Tangle. "Grandmother," answered the lady. "Is it really?" "Yes, indeed. I never tell stories, even in fun." "How good of you!" "I couldn't if I tried. It would come true if I said it, and then I should be punished enough." And she smiled like the sun through a summer shower. "But now," she went on, "I must get you washed and dressed, and then we shall have some supper." "Oh, I had supper long ago," said Tangle. "Yes, indeed you had," answered the lady. 3 years ago. You don't know that it is 3 years since you ran away from the bears. You are 13 and more now." Tangle could only stare. She felt quite sure it was true. "You will not be afraid of anything I do with you, will you?" said the lady. "I will try very hard not to be, but I can't be certain, you know," replied Tangle. "I like your saying so, and I shall be quite satisfied," answered the lady. She took off the girl's nightgown, rose with her in her arms, and going to the wall of the cottage, opened a door. Then Tangle saw a deep tank, the sides of which were filled with green plants, which had flowers of all colors. There was a roof over it like the roof of the cottage. It was filled with beautiful clear water, in which swam a multitude of such fishes as the one that had led her to the cottage. It was the light of their colors that showed in the place in which they were. The lady spoke some words Tangle could not understand, and threw her into the tank. The fish came crowding about her. 2 or 3 of them got under her head and kept it up. The rest of them scrubbed themselves all over her, and with their wet feathers washed her quite clean. Then the lady, who had been looking on all the time, spoke again, whereupon some 30 or 40 of the fishes rose out of the water underneath Tangle, and so bore her up to the arms of the lady who held them out to her. She carried her back to the fire, and having dried her well, opened a chest, and taking out the finest linen garments, smelling of grass and lavender, put them upon her, and over all a green dress, just like her own, shining like hers, and soft like hers, and going into just such lovely folds from the waist, where it was tied with a brown cord, to her bare feet. "Won't you give me a pair of shoes, too, grandmother?" said Tangle. "No, my dear, no shoes. Look here, I wear no shoes." So saying, she lifted her dress a little, and there were the loveliest white feet, but no shoes. Then Tangle was content to go without shoes, too. And the lady sat down with her again, and combed her hair, and brushed it, and then left it to dry while she got the supper. First she got bread out of one hole in the wall, then milk out of another, then several kinds of fruit out of a third, and then she went to the pot on the fire and took out the fish, now nicely cooked, and as soon as she had pulled off its feathered skin, ready to be eaten. "But," exclaimed Tangle, as she stared at the fish and could say no more. "I know what you mean," returned the lady. "You do not like to eat the messenger that brought you home. But it is the kindest return you can make. The creature was afraid to go until it saw me put the pot on, and heard me promise it should be boiled the moment it returned with you. Then it darted out of the door at once. You saw it go into the pot of itself the moment it entered, did you not?" "I did," answered Tangle, "and I thought it very strange, but then I saw you and forgot all about the fish." "In Fairyland," resumed the lady as they sat down to the table, "the ambition of the animals is to be eaten by the people, for that is their highest end in that condition. But they are not therefore destroyed. Out of that pot comes something more than the dead fish, you will see." Tangle now remarked that the lid was on the pot, but the lady took no further notice of it till they had eaten the fish, which Tangle found nicer than any fish she had ever tasted before. It was as white as snow and as delicate as cream, and the moment she had swallowed a mouthful of it, a change she could not describe began to take place in her. She heard a murmuring all about her, which became more and more articulate, and at length, as she went on eating, grew intelligible. By the time she had finished her share, the sounds of all the animals in the forest came crowding through the door to her ears, for the door still stood wide open, though it was pitch dark outside, and they were no longer sounds only, they were speech, and speech that she could understand. She could tell what the insects in the cottage were saying to each other, too. She had even a suspicion that the trees and flowers all about the cottage were holding midnight communications with each other, but what they said she could not hear. As soon as the fish was eaten, the lady went to the fire and took the lid off the pot. A lovely little creature in human shape with large white wings rose out of it, and flew round and round the roof of the cottage, then dropped fluttering and nestled in the lap of the lady. She spoke to it some strange words, carried it to the door, and threw it out into the darkness. Tangle heard the flapping of its wings die away in the distance. "Now, have we done the fish any harm?" she said, returning. "No," answered Tangle. "I do not think we have. I should not mind eating one every day. They must wait their time, like you and me too, my little Tangle." And she smiled a smile which the sadness in it made more lovely. "But," she continued, "I think we may have one for supper tomorrow." So saying, she went to the door of the tank and spoke, and now Tangle understood her perfectly. "I want one of you," she said, "the wisest." Thereupon the fishes got together in the middle of the tank, with their heads forming a circle above the water, and their tails a larger circle beneath it. They were holding a council in which their relative wisdom should be determined. At length one of them flew up into the lady's hand, looking lively and ready. "You know where the rainbow stands?" she asked. "Yes, mother, quite well," answered the fish. "Bring home a young man you will find there, who does not know where to go." The fish was out of the door in a moment. Then the lady told Tangle it was time to go to bed, and opening another door on the side of the cottage, showed her a little arbor, cool and green, with a bed of purple heath growing in it, upon which she threw a large wrapper made of the feathered skins of the wise fishes, shining gorgeous in the firelight. Tangle was soon lost in the strangest, loveliest dreams, and the beautiful lady was in every one of her dreams. In the morning she woke to the rustle of leaves over her head and the sound of running water. But to her surprise she could find no door, nothing but the moss-grown wall of the cottage. So she crept through an opening in the arbor and stood in the forest. Then she bathed in a stream that ran merrily through the trees and felt happier, for having once been in her grandmother's pond she must be clean and tidy ever after, and having put on her green dress felt like a lady. She spent that day in the woods, listening to the birds and beasts and creeping things. She understood all they said, though she could not repeat a word of it, and every kind had a different language, while there was a common though more limited understanding between all the inhabitants of the forest. She saw nothing of the beautiful lady, but she felt that she was near her all the time, and she took care not to go out of sight of the cottage. It was round, like a snow hut or a wigwam, and she could see neither door nor window in it. The fact was it had no windows, and though it was full of doors, they all opened from the inside, and could not even be seen from the outside. She was standing at the foot of a tree in the twilight, listening to a quarrel between a mole and a squirrel, in which the mole told the squirrel that the tail was the best of him, and the squirrel called the mole Spade-Fists, when, the darkness having deepened around her, she became aware of something shining in her face, and looking round, saw the door of the cottage was open, and the red light of the fire flowing from it like a river through the darkness. She left mole and squirrel to settle matters as they might, and darted off to the cottage. Entering, she found the pot boiling on the fire, and the grand lovely lady sitting on the other side of it. "I have been watching you all day," said the lady. "You shall have something to eat by and by, but we must wait till our supper comes home." She took Tangle on her knee and began to sing to her, such songs as made her wish she could listen to them forever. But at length in rushed the shining fish and snuggled down in the pot. It was followed by a youth who had outgrown his worn garments. His face was ruddy with health, and in his hand he carried a little jewel which sparkled in the firelight. The first words the lady said were, "What is that in your hand, Mossy?" Now Mossy was the name his companions had given him, because he had a favorite stone covered with moss, on which he used to sit whole days reading, and they said the moss had begun to grow upon him too. Mossy held out his hand. The moment the lady saw that it was the golden key, she rose from her chair, kissed Mossy on the forehead, and made him sit down on her seat, and stood before him like a servant. Mossy could not bear this, and rose at once, but the lady begged him with tears in her beautiful eyes to sit and to let her wait on him. "But you are a great, splendid, beautiful lady," said Mossy. "Yes, I am, but I work all day long. That is my pleasure, and you will have to leave me so soon." "How do you know that, if you please, madam?" asked Mossy. "Because you've got the golden key." "But I don't know what it is for. I can't find the keyhole. Will you tell me what to do?" "You must look for the keyhole. That is your work. I cannot help you. I can only tell you that if you look for it, you will find it." "What kind of box will it open? What is there inside?" "I do not know. I dream about it, but I know nothing." "Must I go at once?" "You must stop here tonight and have some of my supper, but you must go in the morning. All I can do for you is to give you clothes. Here is a girl called Tangle, whom you must take with you." "That will be nice," said Mossy. "No, no," said Tangle. "I don't want to leave you. Please, grandmother." "You must go with him, Tangle. I am sorry to lose you, but it will be the best thing for you. Even the fishes, you see, have to go into the pot and then out into the dark. If you fall in with the old man of the sea, mind you ask him whether he has got more fishes ready for me. My tank is getting thin." So saying, she took the fish from the pot and put the lid on as before. They sat down and ate the fish, and then the winged creature rose from the pot, circled the roof, and settled on the lady's lap. She talked to it, carried it to the door, and threw it out into the dark. They heard the flap of its wings die away in the distance. The lady then showed Mossy into just such another chamber as that of Tangle, and in the morning he found a suit of clothes laid beside him. He looked very handsome in them. But the wearer of grandmother's clothes never thinks about how he or she looks, but thinks always how handsome other people are. Tangle was very unwilling to go. "Why should I leave you? I don't know the young man," she said to the lady. "I am never allowed to keep my children long. You need not go with him except you please, but you must go some day, and I should like you to go with him, for he has the golden key. No girl need be afraid to go with a youth that has the golden key. You will take care of her, Mossy, will you not?" "That I will," said Mossy. And Tangle cast a glance at him, and thought she should like to go with him. "And," said the lady, "if you should lose each other as you go through the I never can remember the name of that country. Do not be afraid, but go on and on." She kissed Tangle on the mouth and Mossy on the forehead, led them to the door, and waved her hand eastward. Mossy and Tangle took each other's hands and walked away into the depth of the forest. In his right hand Mossy held the golden key. They wandered thus a long way, with endless amusement from the talk of the animals. They soon learned enough of their language to ask them necessary questions. The squirrels were always friendly, and gave them nuts out of their own hoards, but the bees were selfish and rude, justifying themselves on the grounds that Tangle and Mossy were not subjects of their queen, and charity must begin at home, though indeed they had not one drone in their poorhouse at the time. Even the blinking moles would fetch them an earth nut or truffle now and then, talking as if their mouths as well as their eyes and ears were full of cotton wool or their own velvety fur. By the time they got out of the forest they were very fond of each other, and Tangle was not in the least sorry that her grandmother had sent her away with Mossy. At length the trees grew smaller and stood farther apart, and the ground began to rise, and it got more and more steep, till the trees were all left behind, and the two were climbing a narrow path with rocks on each side. Suddenly they came upon a rude doorway, by which they entered a narrow gallery cut in the rock. It grew darker and darker till it was pitch dark, and they had to feel their way. At length the light began to return, and at last they came out upon a narrow path on the face of a lofty precipice. This path went winding down the rock to a wide plain, circular in shape, and surrounded on all sides by mountains. Those opposite to them were a great way off, and towered to an awful height, shooting up sharp blue ice-enameled pinnacles. An utter silence reigned where they stood. Not even the sound of water reached them. Looking down, they could not tell whether the valley below was a grassy plain or a great still lake. They had never seen any place look like it. The way to it was difficult and dangerous, but down the narrow path they went and reached the bottom in safety. They found it composed of smooth, light-colored sandstone, undulating in parts, but mostly level. It was no wonder to them now they had not been able to tell what it was, for this surface was everywhere crowded with shadows. It was a sea of shadows. The mass was chiefly made up of the shadows of leaves innumerable, of all lovely and imaginative forms, waving to and fro, floating and quivering in the breath of a breeze whose motion was unfelt, whose sound was unheard. No forests clothed the mountain sides, no trees were anywhere to be seen, and yet the shadows of the leaves, branches, and stems of all various trees covered the valley as far as their eyes could reach. They soon spied the shadows of flowers mingled with those of the leaves, and now and then the shadow of a bird with open beak and throat distended with song. At times would appear the forms of strange, graceful creatures running up and down through the shadow bowls and along the branches to disappear in the wind-tossed foliage. As they walked, they waded knee-deep in the lovely lake, for the shadows were not merely lying on the surface of the ground, but heaped up above it like substantial forms of darkness, as if they had been cast upon 1,000 different planes of the air. Tangle and Mossy often lifted their heads and gazed upward to descry whence the shadows came, but they could see nothing more than a bright mist spread above them, higher than the tops of the mountains, which stood clear against it. No forests, no leaves, no birds were visible. After a while they reached more open spaces, where the shadows were thinner, and came even to portions over which shadows only flitted, leaving them clear for such as might follow. Now a wonderful form, half bird-like, half human, would float across on outspread sailing pinions. Anon an exquisite shadow group of gambolling children would be followed by the loveliest female form, and that again by the grand stride of a titanic shape, each disappearing in the surrounding press of shadowy foliage. Sometimes a profile of unspeakable beauty or grandeur would appear for a moment and vanish. Sometimes they seemed lovers that passed linked arm in arm, sometimes father and son, sometimes brothers in loving contest, sometimes sisters entwined in gracefulest community of complex form. Sometimes wild horses would tear across, free or bestrode by noble shadows of ruling men. But some of the things which pleased them most they never knew how to describe. About the middle of the plain they sat down to rest in the heart of a heap of shadows. After sitting for a while, each looked up and saw the other in tears. They were each longing after the country whence the shadows fell. "We must find the country from which the shadows come," said Mossy. "We must, dear Mossy," replied Tangle. "What if your golden key should be the key to it?" "Ah, that would be grand," returned Mossy, "but we must rest here for a little, and then we shall be able to cross the plain before night." So he lay down on the ground, and about him on every side and over his head was the constant play of the wonderful shadows. He could look through them and see the one behind the other till they mixed in a mass of darkness. Tangle, too, lay admiring and wondering and longing after the country whence the shadows came. When they were rested, they rose and pursued their journey. And we will pursue their journey with them next time.